Hi! First and foremost, before natin simulan ang lahat, let me thank you again sa pagtangkilik ng mga uploads ko. Last September 25 nga, tayo ay umabot na ng 1,000 subscribers. Yay! As of now, tayo ay nasa mahigit 1,270 na po. Salamat po! Sa kabila po ng busy na schedule natin, I will continually include sa schedule ko yung paggawa ng mga video lectures. For now, simulan na po natin. Today, we will continue pa rin sa discussion ng kinds of obligations classified according to performance. Ito po ay ang divisible and indivisible obligations. That is Article 1223 to 1225. Medyo madali lang ang topic na to kasi somehow, na-discuss na rin naman natin siya, yung concept niya previously. Okay? So, Article 1223. The divisibility or indivisibility of the things that are the object of the obligations in which there is only one debtor and only one creditor does not alter or modify the provisions of Chapter 2 of this title. So, okay. Actually, obviously, this provision talks about divisibility or indivisibility of the things that are the object of the obligations. So, what is o ano nga ba yung ibig sabihin ng divisible and indivisible obligations? From the word itself, divisible obligations, kapag capable of partial fulfillment. So, for example, to deliver 200 kilos of sugar, di ba? Tapos, pag indivisible obligation naman, kapag hindi capable of partial fulfillment. So, example nga dito, to deliver a specific car. It's as simple as that, okay? Now, what are the kinds of indivisibility? Meron tayong legal indivisibility. Pag ang batas mismo ang nagsabi na ito ay indivisible. Second, conventional indivisibility. Ito naman ay pag nasa kasunduan or nasa agreement ng parties na indivisible ang obligation na to. And third, yung natural or absolute. Pag ang nature ng object or prestations does not admit of division. So, example nga is yung to give a particular car, to sing a song. Dahil sa nature ng object mismo, hindi pwedeng maging divisible. Okay? Now, how about kinds of division? Meron din naman, okay? First, yung quantitative. Dito, yung pag sinabi mong quantitative, from the word itself, quantity. So, meaning, nakadepende siya sa quantity. Example, Pogi and Ganda divides the 200 kilos of sugar. So, magiging tag 100 kilos of sugar sila. So, paano yung hatian? By quantity. Second naman is yung qualitative. So, dito, irrespective naman sa quantity, yung tinitingnan is yung by quality. Example, if si Pogi and Ganda naman are ears, kung naging tagapagmana sila ng namayapan nilang magulang, halimbawa ay magkapatid nga sila and they agreed to divide their inheritance. So, halimbawa nga is ang hatian nila ay ganito. Kay Pogi is ang lupa. Kay Ganda is ang bahay. Tapos kung kapatid rin nila si Beauty, pwede ring kay Beauty is yung sasakyan. So, irrespective of the quantity, by quality yung pag-divide or yung paghahatian. Tapos lastly, isa pang kind ng division is yung intellectual or moral. It is one which is consists or exists only in the minds of the parties. Yung wala talagang actual na hatian, nasa isip lamang. Bakit ba? Kasi nga, halimbawa, ganito. Suppose, yung na-inherit ni Pogi and Ganda is yung sasakyan. So, as co-owners ng sasakyan, hindi naman nila pwedeng hatiin yung sasakyan as equal parts, di ba? Paano yun? So, the car is actually not separable in material way, but only mentally. Okay? So, meron tayong test for the distinction. Ito daw, in determining whether an obligation is divisible or not, Okay? So, sa pagtukoy kung ang isang obligasyon ay divisible or hindi, the controlling circumstance is not the possibility or impossibility of partial prestation, but the purpose of the obligation or the intention of the parties. Okay? So, yung controlling circumstance is yung purpose ng obligation talaga. Kung ano yung intention ng parties. Is it for to be divisible obligation ba or para maging indivisible obligation talaga? Okay? Note also, an obligation is presumed indivisible where there is only one creditor and only one debtor. So, sinasabi rin yan ni Article 12.23. So, question, ang Article 12.23 ba ay tumutukoy or applicable lamang sa real obligations? Meaning sa obligation to give lang at hindi sa obligation to do and not to do? Kasi pag binasa mo, it seems that it speaks only with the things, di ba? The word is used in its broad sense, meaning it is actually, it is referring to the object or prestation of the obligation, which may be to deliver a thing or to render some service. Okay? Just in case, although I assume alam nyo na to since na-discuss na natin to actually sa general provisions pa ng obligations. Yung discussion sa elements ng obligations, di ba kasama dun is yung object of the obligations or prestations? Pero gusto ko lang malinaw sa lahat bago tayo mag-proceed. Para klaro, baka lang until now meron pang nako-confused or hindi pa alam to. Okay? Please note, the object of the obligation always consists in an activity or conduct to be observed by the debtor towards the creditor. This conduct to be observed is also known as the prestation. Iba ang object of obligation sa object ng prestation. Okay, let's take an example para mas klaro. In an obligation to deliver a car, suppose Pogi obliged himself to deliver a car to Ganda. Okay, sa ganitong obligation. Yung obligation is yung pag-deliver ni Pogi ng car kay Ganda. So, ano naman yung prestation or the object of the obligation? Ito yung delivery of the car, di ba? And yung car mismo na i-deliver ni Pogi kay Ganda, siya yung object of prestation. Okay? Malinaw? Ito, another example. If Pogi obliged himself to build or construct a house for Ganda. Pag ganito, yung obligation is yon. Yun na yung obligation. Yung obligation ni Pogi to contract or build a house for Ganda. Yung prestation or yung object ng obligation is yung pag-build or yung pag-construct ng house para kay Ganda. Tapos, yung house mismo, siya yung object ng prestation. Okay? Malinaw ba? Keep in mind, pag narinig nyo yung object of the obligation versus the object of the prestation. Kasi iba sila, okay? So now, proceed tayo sa examples para sa Article 12.23 para mas maintindihan natin sa 12.23. Pogi agreed to pay Ganda 1,000 pesos in 4 equal monthly installments. So, the obligation of Pogi is divisible because it is capable of partial performance, di ba nga? Installments pa nga 4 equal installments. Tapos, pero pag yung agreement is that Pogi will pay Ganda on a certain day, say example yon ang December 25, the full amount of 1,000 pesos. So, the obligation is indivisible. Although the money is physically divisible because the intention of the parties is that the obligation must be fulfilled at one time and as a whole, meaning hindi partially, so magiging indivisible siya. Okay? The divisibility of the obligation should not therefore be confused with the divisibility of the thing which is the object of the prestation. Right? Now, Pogi obliged himself to deliver to Ganda a specific car on December 25. So, this obligation, obviously, pabalik-balik na yung example, is indivisible because it is not capable of partial performance. Hindi talaga, hindi mo pwedeng ibigay ang kalahati ng car today, tapos later yung kalahati. The car must be delivered at one time and as a whole. Now, suppose the agreement is that Pogi will deliver one half of the car on December 15 and the other half of the car on December 30. And let's assume na nag-agree talaga yung dalawa, si Pogi at si Ganday, okay lang sa kanila ganun. Half nung car, tapos later on pa yung half. Will the obligation be divisible or indivisible? So the obligation is still indivisible, and Pogi must deliver the whole car either on December 15 or December 25. Okay, that's it. Proceed tayo kay Article 1224. So, before that, explain lang natin ulit yung joint indivisible obligation. Pag joint indivisible obligation, yung object ng obligation is indivisible, and yet, the parties are merely bound jointly. Remember ha, pag sinabing object of the obligation, yun yung diniscuss ko kanina. So, sana pag may narinig kayong object of the obligation, gets nyo na kung ano yung ibig sabihin. Yun nga yung sinabi ko, okay? Anyway, discuss na natin kung ano yung sinasabi ni Article 1224. Ito is, nagdi-discuss siya ng effects of non-compliance by a debtor in a joint indivisible obligation. Actually, alam nyo na to. If may isang debtor sa joint indivisible obligations, ang hindi makapag-comply ng obligation niya, yung sa part niya, the obligation is transformed into one for damages to pay money. At ang sabi ng Article 1224, ito, the debtors who may have been ready to fulfill their promises shall not contribute to the indemnity beyond the corresponding portion of the price of the thing or of the value of the service in which the obligation consists. So, meaning, the innocent debtor shall not contribute beyond their respective shares of the obligations. Kasi unfair. He is, after all, ready and willing to comply with his obligations, di ba? So, meaning the obligation becomes a divisible one. Now, let's compare this with solidary obligation. In a solidary obligation, the breach by a co-debtor makes all debtors liable for damages. The obligations remain solidary without prejudice to their right against the guilty or the negligent debtor. So, pag solidary kasi nga, once for all for one sila. So, meaning, pag yung breach ng co-debtor, pag may isang co-debtor nila na hindi makapag-comply ng kanyang obligation, silang lahat ay magiging liable for damages. Although, meron lang silang right to go against that negligent or guilty debtor. So, this is unlike sa joint indivisible obligation. Well, actually, this provision has already been explained under Article 1209. Proceed na tayo kay 1225. So, obviously, ang article na to talks about the rule para ma-determine natin ang divisibility or indivisibility ng obligation. I think settled na tayo sa rule na yung purpose ng obligation is the controlling circumstance sa pag-determine if the obligation is divisible or not divisible. These rules applies not only to obligations to give but also to obligations to do and not to do. So, what are obligations na divisible? At ano naman yung indivisible? So, ano nga ba yung sabi ni Article 1225? So, paragraph 1 and 3 talks about indivisible obligations. Yung paragraph 2 naman, yung nagto-talks about divisible obligations. So, ito. I-discuss na natin what are deemed indivisible obligations. So, sa paragraph 1, may dalawang situation. First is yung obligation to give definite things daw. Yun. Indivisible daw yun, sabi ni paragraph 1. Example, pabalik-balik na is to deliver a specific car. Okay? Definite things talaga. Pag ganun daw, sinabi ko na nga kanina, indivisible. Tapos, second naman, sa article, sa paragraph 1 is yung obligation which are not susceptible of partial performance. So, example nga dito is yung obligation to render a dance. Hindi man naman pwedeng partial. Okay? Partial lang, kalahati lang muna yung sa skembot mo ngayon. Tapos, next time naman yung kalahati. Here, so the obligation is indivisible by reason of its purpose, which requires the performance of all the parts. Okay? Pero may tanong, is the obligation still indivisible ba raw if there are more than one participant? Okay? So, pag ganito daw, the obligation becomes divisible as far as the participants are concerned. Kasi marami ng participants. So, pwede nang para magiging capable of partial performance na siya as to the number of participants na sasayaw, di ba? So, proceed tayo sa third paragraph. Kasi eto, nagdi-discuss nga rin siya ng ano nga ba yung mga deemed indivisible obligations. Sabi rin, even though the object or service may be physically divisible, an obligation is indivisible if so provided by law or intended by the parties. Okay? So, kahit pa divisible ang physically divisible, pwedeng ma-divide, pero pag sinabi ng batas or nasa kasunduan nyo na it is indivisible pa rin yung obligations na yan. Okay? So, merong another two scenarios dito sa paragraph 3 kung saan deemed indivisible pa rin yung obligations. So, isa na nga dito is when the obligation is so provided by law to be indivisible. So, example is yung payment ng tax. Under the law, taxes should be paid within a definite period. So, although money is physically divisible, the amount of tax payable must be delivered as a whole. Dapat yun talaga. Hindi pwedeng half muna ngayon, tapos 3/4, tapos paunti-unti. Sa pagbayad ng tax, full amount naman talaga yung babayaran natin. Hindi partial. Right? Tapos yung sa next scenario ng deemed indivisible is yung if it is intended by the parties to be indivisible, right? So, example, the obligation of Pogi to give 1,000 pesos to Ganda on a certain date. So, obviously, yung money naman is divisible. But then, dahil nga sa yung intention ng parties is to give the full or yung full amount talaga na 1,000 pesos at one time and as a whole, so magiging indivisible siya. Right? Pero may tanong pa ulit, suppose meron daw dalawang debtors. Hindi lang isa, hindi lang si Pogi yung debtor, si Beauty at saka si Pogi yung debtors ng 1,000 pesos. Magiging indivisible pa rin ba? So, the obligation becomes divisible as far as Beauty and Pogi are concerned dahil hahatiin nila yung 1,000 pesos in parts. 500 kay Pogi, 500 kay Ganda para mabuo yung 1,000 pesos. However, as far as yung sa creditor, sa kay Ganda, the obligation remains indivisible because its performance cannot be done in parts. Hindi pwedeng mauna si Pogi tapos si Beauty. Isa pa rin yun. Once nila bibigay yung payment nila on due date. Right? So, proceed tayo sa ano naman, yung sinasabi ni second paragraph. Balikan na natin to. Ito nga is, nagdi-discuss ng obligations which are deemed divisible. Kanina, deemed indivisible. Ito, deemed divisible. So, first, when the obligation has for its object the execution of a certain numbers of days of work. Well, it's as simple as when a laborer is hired to work for 10 days. Ganon. Now, another scenario na deemed divisible is yung karugtong ng phrase na yon. Sabi, the accomplishment of work by metrical units. So, example is when a laborer is hired to construct a street 3 meters wide and 50 meters long. Ganon. So, by metrical units, deemed divisible daw siya. And another scenario sa second paragraph is sabi, or analogous things which by their nature are susceptible of partial performance. So, yung mga obligations which is by their nature are susceptible nga ng partial performance. Example, yung pagbabayad ng utang in an installment basis, ganon. Or yung obligation to teach, obligation and contracts in 1 year. So, yun, divisible. Or when hiring a security guard to which will work from 8 p.m. to hanggang sa madaling araw for 6 months. So, yun na yung mga obligation that can be performed divisibly. Hindi pwedeng indivisibly, di ba? So, by its nature, divisible talaga siya. Okay, recap lang. Divisible and indivisible obligations have nothing to do with the object of the prestations. Yung misconception dito is pag yung object ng prestation is divisible, magiging divisible din yung obligation. Hindi. The obligation is dependent upon yun, yung nasa rule na diniscuss natin. So, divisibility of the object does not mean that the obligation is also divisible. But the indivisibility of the object necessarily means na indivisible yung obligation. So, example ha, if X is supposed to deliver 1,000 kilos of sugar, this does not mean na X can deliver sugar in installments, right? Divisible yung object ng prestation, which is 1,000 kilos of sugar, but then, kung sa agreement naman nila is isahan yung ibibigay. So, magiging indivisible pa rin siya. It does not necessarily follow na pag divisible ang prestation, I mean yung object ng prestation, magiging divisible obligation din siya. Okay? Kasi nga, even though the object or the service may be physically divisible, an obligation is indivisible if it is provided by law or if it is intended by the parties. Now, before we forget, yung sa last paragraph, divisibility or indivisibility in an obligations not to do. So, in negative obligations not to do, the character of the prestation in each particular case shall determine their divisibility or indivisibility. Okay, so that's it. That's Article 12, 25, and that's yun na yung topic natin sa divisible and indivisible obligations. Thank you for watching until the end. If nagustuhan nyo at nakatulong tong video na to, please like, and kung hindi pa kayo nakakapag-subscribe, paki-subscribe na rin, paki-click yung bell button para naman ma-notify ka pag may bago kaming uploads. Thank you again!